America Viva. On the road, talking about lived history, remarkable places, and real life.
Hello and welcome to On the Road. My name is Tom Noga. Today's episode is about Diego Armando Maradona. Why Maradona? Why today? Because the Soccer World Cup in Canada, the US and Mexico will kick off in a couple of days. And because almost 40 years ago at the World Cup in Mexico, again Mexico, Maradona made football history. Or as the Italian sports commentator Bruno Pizzol puts it, in my 3-part podcast about Maradona, the World Cup in 1986 was not won by Argentina, but by Diego Maradona. You'll find links to my podcast on my websites. It's available in English, in German, and in Spanish. So, Maradona. I'm his generation, born in the same year. I grew up at a time when we happened to see the great football players from South America only once every 4 years, at a World Cup. In between, only if they happened to play against a German team in a European club competition. Everything else simply wasn't shown on TV. I first heard about Maradona in 1979 when he won the FIFA World Youth Championship with Argentina. Back then, the country was said to have two extraordinary talents, Maradona, but above all, Ramon Diaz. Well, today that name is only known to experts. The first time I actually saw Maradona was at the Mundialito, the mini World Cup in Uruguay in 1981, in a match against Germany. I wasn't particularly impressed, nor was I at the World Cup in Spain 1982, 2 goals and a red card. But then came Mexico in 1986. That was his World Cup. 5 goals, 5 assists, including the brilliant through ball to Borchaga in the final. Against us, against Germany, unfortunately. And above all, the match against England. The hand of God when he lofted the ball over England's goalkeeper Peter Shilton with his hand. And the goal of the century, a solo run from more than half the length of the pitch. Only 4 minutes separated those 2 goals. It is hard to imagine a more perfect summary of everything that made Maradona who he was. Even more than the World Cup title itself, that match shaped how Maradona was perceived in his homeland. But I only understood that years later, when I first visited Argentina. Britain had been a colonial power and the birthplace of football. And then there was the Falklands War, a brief conflict over an island group of Argentina's coast that belongs to Great Britain, the Falkland Islands, or Las Islas Malvinas in Spanish. A World Cup match as a symbolic revenge for a lost war. The fact that Diego Maradona was far more than a soccer player and remains so even after his death, more than Mario Kempes and Lionel Messi, for instance, who also led Argentina to World Cup titles, can still be felt throughout the country today. Not only in conversations about football, but in everyday life. In the way people talk about him. He was never just one subject among many. He is a point of reference. A boy from the people who rose from the very bottom to the very top and had to pay a high price for it. How high that price was becomes visible and above all audible in the last interviews Maradona gave. What surprised me back then was not how great he was. It was how little his contradictions diminished that greatness. In many countries, a player either is celebrated or criticized. With Maradona, both was possible. Maradona stands for success, but also for failure, for pride, and for losing control. Those contradictions were never resolved. They are widely accepted. Perhaps that is the crucial difference. Maradona was not a hero despite his contradictions, he was a hero because of them. That is something outsiders often struggle to understand because we are used to telling clear story, rise, triumphs, fall. But that structure does not really work with Maradona, or only in part. I remember conversations in which people express admiration and criticism at the very same time, not as a contradiction. The two belong together. It was not a problem. It was part of what made him who he was. Years later, I realized that this perception had changed. That has more to do with our times than with Maradona himself. We have forgotten how to live with contradictions, how to accept that the world is not simply black and white, but also that a work of art can be viewed independently of its creator. I do not have to like Maradona to think that his second goal against England was magnificent, that the artist's creative self is not necessarily the same as a private individual, and that sometimes the artist cannot even control it, that there are parts of ourselves we never ever get rid of, no matter how famous, celebrated, or admired we might become. Maradona was such a case. That is what I learned in Argentina. Deep down, he always remained the little boy from the shanty town of Villa Florito, on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. A boy who was given nothing, who had to fight for everything, sometimes with tricks. A boy who became a global superstar and yet was never truly welcomed into the club of the elites, the power brokers, and old money. There was always something dark beneath Maradona's triumphs, just as in the match against England, the deceitful and the sublime compressed into 4 minutes. That is what fascinated me and why I made the podcast Maradona, Myth and Reality. Not because I wanted to know who he really was, he probably could not have answered that himself, but because I wanted to understand how someone could be both hero and villain at the very same time, and why people let him get away with it, and still do, when they would never do the same for so many others. Maradona is not a finished figure. He is more like an open system, as we tend to say today, something that is constantly reinterpreted, depending on who is looking at him, and when, and from which angle, because he embodies something that goes beyond sports, something connected to experience, to fractures, to growth, to a life that was never straightforward. That is why he feels so close to us. In the end, Maradona is a screen onto which we project our own hopes and fears. Success, failure, hope, disappointment, and above all, the determination to get back up again and again. I cannot think of another soccer player for whom all this could be said. And that's where we leave it for today. If you enjoyed this episode of On the Road, please give it a like, subscribe to it, and leave a comment. And listen to Maradona, Myth and Reality, my podcast. You'll find it on my websites in English, German, and Spanish. The next episode of On the Road will air on Tuesday, June 16th, as usual at 5 p.m. Central European Time. Until then, take care. This is Tom Noga.